All right, thank you for joining. We're just going to hold on for one more minute while I see participants still getting logged into the webinar. We'll start it up in here in one more minute. All right. Welcome to this webinar. It is our second in the series of regional workshop series on transportation resilience and recovery. This webinar and the one previous is brought to you in part by RDPO. They're the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization. Laura Hansen is the project manager and lead kind of with this workshop series, and myself, John MacArthur at Portland State University. And today we're going to be talking about regional transportation resiliency investments and plans. And we have a great series of speakers here, and I'm going to kick off. But first, I want to talk about the webinar Zoom. First of all, the webinar is being recorded and the slides will be posted on our website after the webinar. The webinar is approved for AICP credits. So if you are interested in receiving credit for participating and watching this webinar, please go to the website here listed below. It's the same place that you may have gone to find out about this webinar or sign up for it, but you can then find information about getting those credits. So after the presentations, we'll have a brief discussion, probably about 20 minutes here. So if you are interested in asking a question, you will have at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. Please type your questions there, and we will either try to get them answered after a presenter presents if it's a quick question, or we will ask it during Q&A. So that is an overview. So this is the second of a series of 3 workshops. The final one is going to be looking at best practices. We're hoping to do this in early February. We would like to do it. It will be in person. So we're trying. We don't have a date yet. We're kind of, seeing how things are going as people are getting back to work after the first, finding a place, dealing with some schedule issues at the university as we go back to in winter term. But we will have that date shortly, and we will be providing it to everybody. So I'm not sure if everybody knows, but yesterday we had 2 earthquakes. And so I think often we think about this. I was talking to one of my colleagues who was from LA, and she's like, she recognized that she was always susceptible to an earthquake. And I think often we here don't really feel that. Maybe the people on the coast do, but in Portland, we don't feel them. But there was 2 yesterday. So it's something that we should always keep in the back of mind is it could happen today, tomorrow, hopefully not during this webinar. So what we're trying to do with this webinar is talk about how transportation networks connect communities at different levels. So we have had a project looking at regional transportation routes over the last 2 years, and part of this presentation will be discussing the ETRs, but there is a different level if you look at from statewide to regional to local, how we think about these routes. And our speakers will be talking to this topic. So we have a great group. And first of all, we will have open remarks from President Peterson, who's a Metro Council president. She has joined us for opening remarks. And then the next speaker will be Mike Harriman, who's the State of Oregon Resiliency Officer, and Chaz Jones, was going to be on the call. I think he is, who is the Protective Security Advisor for Region 10 CISA. Next, Kim Ellis will be, who is a Principal Transportation Planner for Metro, will be talking. And then finally from PBOT, both Mauricio Leclerc and Mike Saratella will be talking from the Portland perspective. So I'd like to hand it over to President Peterson.
Good morning, and thank you, John. Much appreciated. It's been great to work with you over the years. And it's my pleasure to join you today and welcome you all to the workshop. Thank you to the participants in taking the time to join the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization and our partners today. For those of you who may not be as familiar with the RDPO, it is a regional organization serving the 5 counties of the Portland, Vancouver metropolitan area to advance disaster preparedness across many disciplines in a collaborative organizational structure. Metro is a member of the organization, and I serve on the RDPO Policy Committee. Say that 5 times fast. I just wanted to quickly talk to you about why disaster preparedness is something that's extremely important to me and very personal. Before I was elected to Metro Council, I was the Washington Secretary of Transportation, the head of WashDOT. It was an incredible experience, but also brought me face to face with 2 key challenges. Within about 6 weeks of starting that job was the 2013 collapse of the I-5 bridge over the Skagit River. Fortunately, no lives were lost in that collapse, and mostly that was because there was a dive crew that was practicing upstream on the Skagit at that moment and was able to load all their gear in and move down and get everybody who had gone into the water out of the water extremely quickly. So thank God for training and thank God for really good timing. But the response during the 4-month bridge replacement process required a tremendous amount of collaboration with local and state officials. Less than a year after the bridge collapse, probably the most difficult day of my life was March 22nd, 2014, when a mountainside collapsed in the Cascade Range, killing 43 people and blocking a main state highway and cutting off the city of Darrington from direct access to school, employment, and one of the only mills up that way to get their product to market. The bridge collapse and the tragic Oso slide are a reminder that disasters take many shapes and sizes. And obviously we have one particular disaster that perpetually comes to mind, and John acknowledged that the Cascadia earthquake is coming someday, is happening, but we have so much work to do to prepare for things we aren't expecting. And what I would just ask of all you today is something that I think probably Kim and everybody at Metro may ever, hopefully never gets too tired of me saying it, and that is we really need to always carry with us in all the work that we do, our values, the goals, and the outcomes. Otherwise, we get lost in the technicalities of the work and we forget about who we're serving, and we're serving people. And that's the main thing I want to just point out today is when we're talking about all these things, we have to plan with humility. To remember that the reason we are here is to know that there are things we can't plan for, but we need to be able to be resilient, and we need to know that when we plan, we're planning for the people, and we can't plan on their behalf. Which gets me to the second value that Metro has been working very hard on. And I ask you to really think about how to incorporate this through and see how it's been incorporated and expand it. We need to center our work on advancing equitable outcomes, recognizing that people are impacted differently by disasters. We need to be able to understand that how downtown bounces back out of COVID is different than how East Multnomah County is bouncing back, if at all, out of COVID, and what those barriers are, right? And because this has been, a pandemic is a disaster, and we have been, as RDPO, really working hard on, and as Metro, plugging the gaps where gaps appeared, and trying to make sure that we were resilient in a way as a bureaucracy to move and shift where people needed us, not where our role was. And we need to know when to get out of the way. While WashDOT was working on how to manage the closure of the highway during the Oso slide, local communities, local people with equipment in the timber industry, not only developed their own search and rescue while waiting for public officials to show up. They also developed their own detour route on an old logging road that paralleled up on the mountainside. And I literally looked the other way. I could have stopped them. I could have cited this. I could have cited that says no. But that was how they did their own search and rescue. And that's how eventually they got their kids back to school and people back to work, was that detour route that they built with their own equipment and some ODOT or WashDOT rock that they knew where it was. So they just used it. So I just want to say, we need to let people do what they're going to need to do to survive. And we're going to need to give them the tools and the flexibility to get it done. And if we're a bunch of bureaucrats, we're just going to hand out forms, we haven't done our job. That is not customer focused. That is not people centered. So what you're going to see today is how we've been focusing in recent years on an area focus for the RDPO and Metro on addressing transportation for emergencies. We recently co-led an update to the region's emergency transportation routes. The results of that project were widely shared. This partnership brought professionals from both the transportation and emergency management fields together to help address the importance of resilient infrastructure and transportation systems. There's more work planned to prioritize, tier, and operationalize this plan in the upcoming year. But the RDPO developed this workshop series to host wider conversations about transportation resilience and recovery. There's a lot of good work in the space at multiple levels. At the first webinar last month, we learned about real world incident learning about transportation in response to the wildfires and winter storms. Today, we will carry that conversation forward with a deeper dive into planning efforts for transportation resilience from state partners, from Metro, and from the City of Portland's efforts to develop a transportation resilient framework at PBOT. And then you will have a final workshop. I just can't stress to all of you, as you're thinking about these things, making sure that this is not just a technical exercise, that you are preparing yourself for the moment when it happens, and you're going to be out in the field, and you have families, friends, relatives. You're trying to manage what's happening at home to what's happening in your job. And how are you going to react when somebody asks you for something and it's not in your role? What is the answer going to be? Is it going to be, I'm going to help you? I'm going to figure this out for you? Or is it going to be, I'm sorry, that's not my job? And in that moment, we have either made or break an entire family. So I just ask you to just remember why we're doing this. And just thank you for spending your time here today. Thank you.
Thank you, President Peterson. And I really appreciate you bringing what we're really here about is people and communities. And, you know, we talk a lot about infrastructure and the hardscape, and but that is what we're doing to help at the moment to get us to be more resilient, so that during response and recovery, we can focus on the people, right? And part of that process of planning, we need to have those people's voices so we understand their needs as we do the planning. So I really appreciate your perspective and making us remember why we're doing this, and the importance of, you know, we're doing it for ourselves too, because we live here with those people, everyone in the region. So thank you so much. So moving on to the first speaker from the state of Oregon, Mike Harriman is going to talk what they've been doing at the state level. So Mike, take it away.
All right, well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I've looked at this as a great opportunity to share some information. This 3-year project we started back in 2018 with Homeland Security. I was really unaware at the time when I took on the job as the state resilience officer that we had these kind of channels through our federal partners to do these assessments. These assessments are competitive, and Homeland Security and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, known as CISA, They do approximately 8 to 10 of these a year, and they started doing them in 2004. And when I say that is, we put in our application based on the, let's go to the next slide, John. Based on the Oregon Resiliency Plan that was introduced in 2013 to legislators. And the Oregon Resiliency Plan is about it's that 50-year view, what the state and people in the state can do to mitigate issues facing a Cascadia subduction zone, earthquake, and follow-on tsunamis. So just to recap, it was a 3-year project. COVID did not slow it down. Almost all the data was collected prior to late 2019. So during that year of 2020, during the first parts of COVID, the men and women back at the Argonne National Laboratory actually did a lot of data crunching and kept me in the loop as a sponsor and provided some updates virtually to the key stakeholders. You'll see I went and underlined the communities that are make up the metro area, Clackamas County, Columbia County, and so forth, that actually participated in many of the regional data calls and also some of the great work that was done by Chas Jones and the CISA folks when we would go to a site and actually spend the entire day with not just like, quote, the county emergency manager, but also if we went to an airport or a seaport, we worked with and had the pleasure of working with a lot of folks that had some sort of connection to those folks. We had to make some, some calls. Now, the cost of the CISA report, this RRAP, Regional Resiliency Assessment Program, RRAP, it's about a $500,000 endeavor. The money is from Homeland Security to CISA to pay basically almost all of the time and energy of the Argonne National Laboratory staff. The state of Oregon didn't pay for any of this. This was all done, but it was done with taxpayer dollars, just so everybody can understand. And, during that period of time, 2017, 2018, there was always a continuing resolution. So we started a little slow in 2018, but it really did take off. And one of the things that really helped us a lot was the state agencies that we really did a lot of work with. You'll see on the left-hand side, had a tremendous rich amount of historical data already to be utilized. And early on, what we decided to do was to flip-flop roads and bridges and make airports our priority because we didn't have a lot of data on some of the airports. Simultaneously, as we were doing this report, Oregon Emergency Management, working with FEMA Region 10, did also some evaluations of some airports. That data was also part of this. So next slide, please. So this just kind of, this next slide, I'll wait for it to pop up. So this just shows you the areas in the airports, seaports, and river ports that were looked at during the assessment. Again, this was from the Oregon Resiliency Plan, Chapter 5, which was on transportation. The bulk of that chapter did ask for assessments to be conducted. It worked out really well in the state's favor that we could do as many as we could. We would have probably selected more than the 12 airports that we had the opportunity to visit, but we just didn't have the amount of time and funding from the Homeland Security folks. And so we are looking at doing a follow-on assessment, a little bit lower scale, but looking at some additional airports such as Pendleton, Madras, Prineville, Corvallis, McMinnville, airports like within the valley. But we did look at some seaports and some river ports. And so for the metro area, the Port of Portland was a great host. We did some great information sharing with the port at the airport and also with Terminal 6. And I'll speak about that in just a second. So the next slide, please. This slide is from our friends out of Region 10, FEMA Region 10. COA stands for Course of Action. Immediately following a Cascadia event, there's going to be a lot of things moving into the state. So the Redmond Airport is known as an intermediate staging base, ISB. And then down in Crater Lake, Klamath Region Airport has also been identified as an ISB. It's good to have two of these because there will be a lot of resources coming in from either FEMA or Department of Defense to come in to provide that initial response, life safety type stuff. As it moves into the valley and on the coast, that's where it gets a little tough because, so much of this is dependent upon what does Mother Nature actually do to the ground that these airports and seaports are at. Now, we do know the seaports will be damaged very heavily, like we saw in Japan in 2011 from debris. So they'll take some time for that to clear out, the debris to clear out, and for the Department of Defense to do what they call over the shore. But for this discussion, I just wanted to kind of show you this concept. This is much of the stuff we're working with the state agency and our local partners and the airport managers that oversee these airports. Next slide. So one of the things we really wanted to do was make sure we had a priority. So if you're not familiar, in 2014, Oregon Department of Transportation did their seismic plus report. In a nutshell, the map on the right shows their primary routes. The map on the left is from what the Argonne National Laboratory folks showed us, how we're going to spiderweb out and really provide some good services. And this is the information that the locals really want to see about their road network. So you'll see this, the green is 2 weeks up to a month. When we talk about response after subduction zone, we're not talking hours, we're talking days and weeks. So, this is the hard part, I think, that the public has a tough time understanding. Many of the resources are going to come to a complete halt. We're going to see some devastation around the fuel hub, no doubt, and that's a topic for another discussion, but just wanted to make sure that people understand that why the state works with the cities and the counties and the tribes on fuel operational plans. And this is one of the reasons, because fuel is that fuel hub is our Achilles heel, and fuel is going to be one of the major pieces of infrastructure that we need to make sure we can move around. So kind of the 1-2 punch that we've seen from the RRAP is, moving stuff up into the Eugene area for that part of the state, and then moving things into the Portland area for that part of the state. Islanding optimization. Next slide, please. One of the things that the Argonne National Laboratory folks did for us and was to take a snapshot of these airports, and using 2010 census data, they identified these islanding spots. And these islands could be, could be landlocked, but we might have a landslide that took out a major road that you heard President Peterson talk about that happened in Washington. We could have liquefaction impact the community. We could have a bridge out. We could have several things that impact these communities. And so what this does for individuals across the state of Oregon helps them really understand their road network and to identify there is some opportunities here to be very successful, and especially around the pre-mitigation work. But this next slide is where I want to spend most of the time of my remainder of my time. This is the greater Portland metropolitan area. And so I live in Clackamas County. So I always tell people you're either going to be at home or work or somewhere in between when this subduction zone does happen. And let's just say we're at home right now and it happens. I want to make sure Clackamas County is doing its part to take care of the vulnerable populations that we've seen over the last couple of years, mainly around wildfires and how that evacuation happened. But one of the resources we need to talk about is in locations is the Port of Portland. The Port of Portland has offered up Terminal 6 as an opportunity for us to try to get to. For what we talked to the Corps of Engineers and the U.S. Coast Guard is they need to plow the Columbia River to the mouth, just like ODOT needs to plow a road over the mountains into the valley. I can tell you, I've mentioned this many times to the Corps of Engineer and the U.S. Coast Guard, and I get that look back like they're glazed, like we can't do that. Oh yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of things that people probably thought they wasn't in their job or their job title. They're going to be they're going to need to pull out some crafty stuff to really make things happen. So we can do not only life safety, but we need to bring in some commodities up the river. Commodities that I'm concerned, like fuel, water. If we can get our footprint into Terminal 6 and bring and establish a temporary fuel spot, that fuel will be able to be utilized to deal with the north portion of the state of Oregon while we're simultaneously trying to move across the valley and get into the Eugene area to handle that part of the state. And then both efforts will be how we move to the coast. So you can see the greens. This is like 2 weeks after the event. There's a lot of opportunity to move resources around. What do we have to move around? We'll have fuel to move around. We'll have first responders to move around. We could have responders coming in from the ISBs that are being brought in by either fixed wing or rotary wing into the Port of Portland, into Hillsborough, into Aurora. The Aurora Airport's very attractive because there are also some of the 3 big heavy lift private sector companies that do a lot of hauling. And so the state of Oregon, about 4 or 5 years ago, had tried to work out an MOU with them, and it wasn't very successful. So we're going to go back and try it again, this time with the Department of Aviation, Department of Administrative Services, to really make sure we have some things in place that can actually happen pretty quickly. I'll go to the last slide, and I want to just kind of emphasize this: all the information that we received from Homeland Security and the CISA folks is public information. It is all on the governor's website. So you'll see the website there for the governor's policy stuff under resiliency on the left-hand side. Not only is full report there, which is a public document, there's also the technical tools that our Argonne National Laboratory staff developed that is very helpful, and the GIS information's there. So, if you're looking to do some additional planning, you can download that into your organization's system. You can then play with the data to see what that means for your geographical area. For the greater Portland metropolitan area, this is exactly what it should be. You guys should be doing as you're talking about counties and stuff like that. One of the things that is important also to understand is we're going to need a lot of open spaces to bring commodities to you. So when we hear the Oregon Department of Energy asking for fuel sites, working with your public works folks and your county emergency management folks who have identified some possible sites that we could move fuel by bladder into, that can help maintain a hospital's generation power, maybe your 911, your first responders, before we figure out how we're even going to tackle and get the public some fuel. I think we're going to find that stuff like that's going to be rationed. But do you need data to do stuff? Do you need data to work on your pre-mitigation applications when you're trying out for FEMA grants? And this information here could be a game changer for your community as you build on those kind of things. And so I think that's my 15 minutes, John, and I'll stick around for questions and turn it over to the next presenter, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And Chaz Jones from CISA was going to be on the call. I knew he was going to a event that he had to be at. It looks like he wasn't able to make this webinar. He also wanted me to relay that he is open to discuss the data, to get deep into it. He was part of the main person leading this report, and is definitely a resource for any entity that wants to dive deep into these tools and data. So if you are interested in that, we can share that his information with everybody. So going to move on to the next presentation with this Kim Ellis from Metro.
Great, thanks, John. And thank you everybody for being here today. As John said, I'm Kim Ellis. I'm a transportation planner with Metro. And today I am going to share a few highlights of not only the regional emergency transportation route work, that was a joint effort with the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization and Metro, but I also wanted to highlight some of the other areas of work that Metro's Planning and Development and Research Department have been doing related to transportation resilience, and then also highlight some opportunities to work with you as we go forward into the next update to our regional transportation plan, which we're just beginning started scoping in October of this year, and will be more formally launched in the coming year. Next slide. I want to also highlight just why is resilience, why does Metro care about resilience? I think President Peterson really highlighted a lot of the reasons why in her opening remarks. There's many different departments in the agency of Metro, and we've long recognized that climate change has been and will increasingly become a more urgent issue for our region. regional disasters such as the earthquake, but other events, the winter storms, heat, flooding, the wildfires, those go beyond jurisdictional lines, and really the planning and preparation and response for those needs to happen sort of at a regional scale, recognizing that there's a state role, but then also more detailed implementation at the local level. And so Metro provides a good place in which to convene some of those larger regional discussions and in partnership with the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization. We also know that we're already experiencing the impacts of climate change, and that many of these hazards that we've been planning for and thinking about are going to be increasing in frequency and severity, again, highlighted by the wildfires that were part of the last workshop, and then even the heat domes that we were experiencing last summer. So thinking about resilience planning at a regional scale, recognizing those threats and the people that we're serving, Metro is uniquely positioned as a federally designated and acknowledged by the governor of the state of Oregon and as a metropolitan planning organization. We also have state requirements around climate mitigation and meeting state greenhouse gas reduction goals. Being responsible for solid waste planning in the region. We also have staff that are working on disaster debris management planning for the region as part of our waste prevention and environmental services program. And then also Metro owns a lot of parks and open spaces, and those provide an important green infrastructure and conservation that are also key to our region's resilience for communities, the economy, as well as our infrastructure. So Metro does, in all of its different roles, does address resilience in a number of different ways. Next slide. One thing for us, Metro and the region, we have really, since the mid-90s, used the 2040 growth concept as a core planning framework that guides how and where we're growing, where we're protecting our natural resources, also the transportation system that's needed to support those planned land uses, and doing so in a way that, as President Peterson said, centering our work on advancing equitable outcomes across the region. Our work touches all of those different outcomes that you see there today, and it guides all of the work that we're doing around resilience and planning for a transportation system that can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and support livable communities, a healthy ecosystem, and advancing our equity and economic prosperity goals together. Next slide. Another aspect of that policy framework is the region's adopted climate smart strategy. As I said, the state mandated that our region develop and implement a strategy for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from cars and light trucks. That was adopted by the Metro Council with broad regional support back in 2014. It's been acknowledged by the State Land Conservation and Development Commission and more fully integrated into our last update to the Regional Transportation Plan in 2018. And so that continues to guide all of our thinking and work and how we're planning for the transportation system of the future in a way that's advancing, achieving those broader outcomes I described earlier, but also meeting those state greenhouse gas reduction goals. Next slide. And a key tool for that is our regional transportation plan. As the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the Oregon portion of the Portland-Vancouver metropolitan area, our plan is guided by these 4 investment priorities: advancing equity, improving safety, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and the impacts of climate change, and also managing congestion. And so as we're thinking about a resilient transportation system, that resilient transportation system also needs to support achieving all 4 of these different outcomes. Next slide. More recently, we had Sasha Pollock, who some of you may know. She led our Metro's resilience program up until we had some significant staff reductions as a result of COVID-19. While she was at Metro, she did an inventory of all of the different efforts across the agency that are working to advance resilience. What she found in that inventory, really that much of our work is focused on mitigation and recovery and disaster preparedness, but focusing on social and economic resilience, and also, as I've said previously, resilience to the climate impacts and the hazards that we described earlier. Next slide. So going forward, I do want to just highlight, this is a broader definition of resilience that the agency has been working with to anticipate, withstand, and bounce back or be resilient in the face of long-term stresses, but also the unexpected shocks, whether they're from natural hazards or social and economic factors, and COVID-19 as part of that. And so now I'm going to just walk through some of the highlights of some of the other work that we're doing under the policy framework. Next slide. The first piece I think that many of you are aware of and have heard about is the Regional Emergency Transportation Route Update. That work was completed earlier this year. Many of the folks and agencies represented here today participated in that. And this was the first update to those routes since 2005. They were first developed in 1996. And one of the goals of that effort was not only to update the routes using some of the more recent Dogami data for seismic, the Cascadia zone impact, but also to start increasing understanding of the resilience of those routes, raising the visibility and importance of having a regional dialogue about planning for investments that are going to be needed to make many of those routes more resilient. We found through this work, many of them are vulnerable to multiple hazards, not just the Cascadia earthquake that many of us have been planning for. And it did make recommendations for a second phase of work that I'll talk about in a moment. But it also became a vehicle to begin linking and thinking about how we're planning for these routes, the needs that they may have to become more resilient, and the role of the regional transportation plan and these regional discussions in helping elevate the need for more investment to improve the region's resilience overall. Next slide. These three graphics here just highlight some of the key project products. There is a detailed technical report. I also want to acknowledge the consultant team that we had working on this with 2E2, led by 2E2, but also Salus Resilience. And then also we had two different GIS firms that supported this work. But the technical report documents all of the methodology, the criteria that we use to evaluate the existing routes and to identify new routes. I think we added more than 60 miles of additional routes, working directly with each of the 5 counties and also cities within the counties, working with emergency managers, as well as transportation planners across the region. That report is on the website that was listed on the previous slide. We also produced large-scale maps that could be used by different agencies, both at a regional scale, but then also for each of the 5 counties. And then new to the work was an online viewer that's been created, and there's a lot of underlying data, GIS data layers that we've also compiled and can be made available to folks that are interested in using the information to help support more localized planning around connectivity, resilience, but also looking at the people that are living in the areas adjacent to where these routes are located. We were looking at the routes, both in terms of their connectivity from outside the region, across the region, but also working to ensure that all the population centers and concentrations of people that are living in the 5-county area were served by these routes. They are not intended at this time to be evacuation routes, but they can be a basis for further work on evacuation planning. There was a lot of interest in these routes as the wildfires were happening back in 2020, and they did provide a way for Clackamas County in particular, but other jurisdictions to be thinking about where people were living, what were routes that could be available to help evacuate the many people that were displaced by those wildfires. Next slide. The next phase of work that'll begin later next year and will go probably into 2023, that will continue to be a joint effort of the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization and Metro. Laura Hansen is here on the call today. John Merman from Metro will be the project manager for Metro on this. And this work is really intended to further tier those routes and prioritize them to then help us as a region begin to better understand the individual vulnerabilities of these routes and to better understand, can serve as a framework to then help identify and prioritize routes for further investment based on the vulnerabilities that they may be facing. We'll be looking as part of that work at the methodology that the Oregon Department of Transportation used to tier their seismic lifeline routes and look to work on applying a similar methodology as part of that. In addition, one thing we found in the phase 1 work was that there isn't a consistent understanding of the roles and responsibilities of different facility owners and operators. Metro and the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization do not own or operate any of these facilities. And so it is important to have a consistent set of guidelines and agreements so that when the routes are activated in the state of an emergency, that it's clear on who's doing what and when, and that there's good communications in place. And so that'll be another significant piece of the work that'll complement the technical work. We also, as part of the phase 1 effort, there was significant engagement of staff from all 5 county area, but also elected officials, and a lot of interest from those elected officials in being more engaged in the second phase of work, particularly because it will help make the case for more investment and resilience across the region. And so there will be more significant engagement as part of this phase 2 work, building on what we did in the previous phase. And the website to the information about the phase 1 project and phase 2, once it gets underway, is the website is there listed below. Next slide. Another couple of things I wanted to highlight too is that the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization worked with Metro and in partnership with the Environmental Protection Agency in 2020 to hold a couple of workshops on resilience. The takeaways, there's a report and a link to the report there in the slide. A couple of takeaways that came out of those workshops of staff and elected officials really is that the region should continue to focus on coordination across the region and really begin working to reduce vulnerability, thinking about climate equity and the intersection of climate equity and public health, and to focus on extreme heat and wildfire smoke. Those are the 2 hazards that are most prevalent and happening now in response to our changing, as a result of our changing climate, and that those are things that could be better addressed in natural hazard mitigation plans that local governments currently develop and implement in the region. Currently, based on a review of the 5 counties, only Clackamas and Multnomah County include extreme heat in their natural hazard plans, and Multnomah County has wildfire smoke as one of the hazards that they've called out. So there is more work that can be done, and there is FEMA funding, because we know in the coming years and decades, with climate change happening, we will continue to experience these hazards on a more regular and more severe basis. Next slide, please. And then finally, there's another project that's underway, also a joint effort of the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization and Metro, that's called the Social Vulnerability Tool Project. This work is very centered on advancing equity and working with community-based organizations to identify what are the barriers that communities are experiencing to accessing emergency services and programs. We know that people are impacted differently by disasters, and that vulnerability itself is measured differently across jurisdictions in our region. This tool and the data sets that are being developed as part of it really will help provide a common set of definitions and data for our region to begin using. They anticipate having an online tool available I think March of next year. There's also going to be some significant data sets that have been using in part census data, but also it's being supplemented with through community engagement directly with communities and community-based organizations across our region. And then Metro and RDPO will be sponsoring training on how to use that information once it's finalized next year. Next slide. So just to highlight, I think some of what John was hoping for today as part of this workshop is just thinking about what are the opportunities to continue expanding transportation resilience in our region. As I said, we are starting the next update to our regional transportation plan. We have some goals and policies around resilience, but we'll be looking to update our climate smart strategy as part of that and expanding how we're thinking about resilience and integrating hazards and green infrastructure into that planning process. The phase 2 emergency transportation routes work is also another key area of collaboration regionally. All of this work will be centered on advancing equitable outcomes, having meaningful engagement that will continue to broaden partnerships, and really looking for ways to leverage the data and the staff and resources that have been developed through many of the things that I described earlier, and having some plans in place that can help increase our competitiveness as a region for federal and state grant funds around resilience. There's also a strong interest at Metro in continuing to expand our expertise and capabilities to do more vulnerability analysis and risk assessment. I think the work that Mike Harriman just presented, also ODOT's climate office is doing a vulnerability assessment of ODOT owned facilities throughout the state of Oregon. There's other work happening in the state and locally and in the region that I think we can leverage and bring together to help inform these two efforts here and many others. So I'll turn it back over to you, John, and thank you for the opportunity to share this work.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks for giving that great overview of the work that Metro's working on and collaborating with, and there's a lot of great information there. I want to remind people that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and if you have a question, please put it in there. After the folks from People Talk, we're going to be opening up for Q&A, so I'd love to get your questions so they can get answered. I'm sure there's lots of good questions out there. So I'll turn it over to Mike and Mauricio to talk from the city perspective here.
Good afternoon. I'm Mauricio Leclerc, a planning manager with the City of Portland Bureau of Transportation. Here with me is Mike Saritella. He's a planner with us and leading a lot of the effort, technical and scoping for the project. He will be presenting. I just want to provide 30 seconds of introduction. First of all, as you already can tell, coordination and collaboration is critical to resiliency. I appreciate hearing today, Mike, and I appreciate the work Metro has done. Mike and myself and others work closely with Kim and Laura on the regional ETR project. So I think I was just put on the chat that please take a look. It's great work, and it's a basis for us to continue our technical work. Secondly, another thing that you'll hear from Mike is that you don't have to start from scratch. Actually, we've been lucky and fortunate that we can build on our assets. We can, this work on resiliency can be built on a great network of walking, cycling, riding transit. So it is basically doing and reinforcing what we're already trying to do, get people out of their cars. And third, the federal government just passed a large infrastructure bill that has resiliency in it for the first time in that kind of language. That is a broad language that addresses many issues, including impacts to climate change. So that's an opportunity that's coming. And you add those 1, 2, 3, coordination, building our own assets, and help attention from the nation, I think we have a great opportunity to do something to address our citizens, not just in the region and the city, but also in the state, in Washington, which is just across the river. So with that, I'll leave it for Mike to go over what we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mauricio, for the introduction. Thank you all for attending today and having us be a part of this important conversation. My name is Mike Saratella. I'm a transportation planner at PBOT, and I'll be running through a presentation that briefly touches on kind of three main topics. One, what we've been up to lately, what we're working on now, and some issues and opportunities that we're working through and thinking about as we engage in this work. Next slide, please. So resiliency is an emerging complex field in planning. And so for us to get started with this, it was important for us to have a good working definition. Next. So what we're working with is we define resiliency as the ability of a community to mitigate impacts, respond to challenges, and recover in the face of both natural and human-generated challenges. Next slide. At PBOT, specifically, as Mauricio mentioned, we see an opportunity to build on our strengths and elevate the role that active transportation plays in a resilient transportation system. Next. And really a kind of a call to action to better integrate resiliency into all aspects of our transportation policies and planning. Next. So here we go, 3 acts. Hold on tight, there's a lot of slides. Next slide. So resiliency is not something new to the city of Portland. It's one of our core values embodied in our city's comprehensive plan. Next. We all read that article in the New Yorker back in 2015, which really, I think, elevated the risk that we live with on a daily basis of the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. It was terrifying and honestly served as a wake-up call for us to look closer at resiliency, both from a kind of city-wide, but also a transportation-specific perspective. And since then, multiple planning efforts and investments have been made, which I'll talk about. Next. This summer, we opened the Flanders Crossing Bridge over I-405. The Flanders Crossing Bridge is a really great example of building on PBOT's emphasis on active transportation and human-powered mobility, and with also an added resiliency lens. So this bike, ped, and emergency vehicle bridge provides a vital link across I-405 in the event of a major earthquake, but it also functions as a really wonderful bike and ped bridge, and was delivered alongside a series of projects in the central city to help reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Next. Similarly, next summer, we'll be completing the Earl Blumenauer Bridge over I-84. This bridge is also designed for bike and ped as its primary use, but can be used as an ETR link in the event of a seismic event, as the other bridges nearby on MLK, Grand, and 12th Avenue are likely to face major damage in the event of an earthquake. Next. In 2020, PBOT's engineering team completed a seismic bridge assessment, which looked at all of the 137 bridges owned by the city. We found that a vast majority of those structures are in some need of repair or replacement. And so to get us started with that very large ticket that you see there, we developed in that report a list of prioritized investments that considered whether the bridge was on an ETR, different equity demographics, and other multimodal priorities. Next. And we really began the year of 2020 focusing on seismic resiliency, but 2020 had different things in store for us, both in Portland, but in the entire world. The COVID-19 pandemic served as an unexpected and major resiliency challenge and a major learning experience for PBOT about how we can adapt our Bureau's standard practices, build on our strengths to rise to the moment and to address novel resiliency challenges. Next slide. We learned a lot. Our experience with our Slow Streets program, which was built off of our neighborhood greenways, where we limited access to vehicles to a 100-mile network of car light streets throughout the city, really helped reaffirm a call to elevate the role active transportation plays in times of crisis and providing access to important places like libraries, schools, grocery stores, pharmacies, places where people connect and get resources. Next. Our experience with the Healthy Businesses program gave us an opportunity to really kind of stretch the definition of street permitting to adapt our streets into vital public spaces and community gathering places. Kind of most visible were the outdoor dining spaces, but these spaces were also used during the pandemic for vaccine clinics, for micro-enterprise zones, and honestly, just spaces for people to come together and heal and connect with one another in a very difficult time. Next. And this novel coronavirus pandemic also highlighted the need for us to consider a broader definition of resiliency challenges. So while earthquake resiliency is still front and center for us, we want to take a broader look. And I think that that's a theme that you're hearing from all the speakers today. Next. So some frameworks that we've been thinking about. This is a graphic that shows kind of the 4 cycles of multiple stages of disaster response. Next slide. We think that PBOT is best, it's okay. We're best positioned to address resiliency challenges in the prepare and invest. So helping build and design a resilient system, but then also in the space of recovery. So how can we help get our city back online after the initial shock of trauma? We see ourselves as a city kind of in this space between community and regional resiliency, an opportunity to kind of frame and think about resiliency challenges at the scale of government that is closest to community. So we can help coordinate those regional efforts to support community resiliency, but also use our role as the kind of most, the closest level of government to help build community capacity so that they can help meet those challenges themselves. Next. The COVID-19 pandemic and access to places and the adaptation of places all throughout our community made us think pretty differently about what we consider infrastructure. So we are an infrastructure bureau, builds roads and bridges and bike facilities and sidewalks. But so there's that physical infrastructure piece. But it really elevated the kind of the role that social and community infrastructure play in helping a community weather a broad range of challenges. So places like libraries that can be used as cooling centers during on a hot day, how we can connect people to those places. And then in terms of social infrastructure, just this this idea that you know, in order for us to reach those who were most impacted and by the pandemic, we really relied on our community-based organization partnerships to help bridge that gap and make that connection. And so the extent to which those organizations play an outsized role in resiliency is very front and center for us. Next. And kind of building off that, this experience with COVID this last year and a half has really underscored the need for us to center equity in our work, and specifically in our resiliency work. We understand that resiliency challenges of all types will exacerbate existing inequities in our system, and that by centering the needs of those who are most vulnerable to those impacts, that is the right starting point for us to look at the ways that we can mitigate these larger systemic forces for the population abroad. And so our charge is to address those resiliency related equity impacts at all levels. Next. So what are we up to now? What's our current work at the City of Portland, or at PBOT? We are in the process of refining and capturing these frameworks, these lessons learned, these definitions into a resiliency strategy document that will be central, that will be incorporated into our TSP work, our transportation system plan work. And in that work, next slide, we'll be looking to elevate and incorporate resiliency into our TSP project identification and prioritization. So right now, despite that being kind of a front and center challenge for the city, for their PBOT, that's not present in our current TSP. So we're looking to add that in kind of thoroughly throughout the document. We'll also be refining our citywide emergency transportation routes using our policies, our risk factors, updated equity data, and our asset data. Next. We'll be exploring new policies and potential new classifications that could help support what we're calling active transportation resiliency routes, those human-powered resiliency routes that emerged during COVID to help support access to important community destinations. And then similarly, to the state's level of looking at islanding effects, we're looking at islanding effects within the city of Portland, looking at areas within the city that are at risk of extreme isolation during a major seismic event. I have a map here of the North Portland Peninsula showing the St. John's neighborhood, which has structurally deficient bridges on all sides right now. And so how can we mitigate and identify and mitigate those potential islanding effects at the city level? Next. Oh, and lastly, in terms of what we're looking at, though we really have taken steps during the pandemic and following and kind of in this long tail of recovery to deepen our relationships with community-based organizations, particularly those serving BIPOC and low-income and immigrant refugee communities in Portland. And we've found a lot of success in deepening those partnerships in terms in our pursuit of kind of reaching those who are most vulnerable to these impacts. And so we'll be continuing to explore ways to deepen and institutionalize sort of those partnerships so that we can build capacity in community and they will be better set up to address those challenges on their own or in partnership with the city. Last slide. And so as we are in this work and we're working on it, three kind of issues and opportunities, maybe this can help seed some of the Q&A, is, this idea of coordination that Mauricio mentioned and that I think has been a theme throughout today, and that really this dialogue space is kind of here to convene us to talk about how do we can coordinate both at the city level and within different scales of governance, specifically looking at overlapping and interconnected infrastructure bureaus, whether that be transportation at different scales or at the city level, how do we coordinate with water and sewer and other infrastructure bureaus that are building things in the physical environment. Again, just this opportunity to continue to deepen and strengthen our partnerships, figuring out ways on which we can do that most effectively. And then really thinking about this unique opportunity with the infrastructure bill that's just passed and our TSP update, really helping identify and elevate those projects that meet, that live at that nexus of resiliency, equity, climate, and our asset management goals and needs. And so that's a rundown of what we've been up to and where we're headed at PBOT. Looking forward to the Q&A. Mauricio, I don't know if you have any thoughts that you'd like to add as we close out.
No, thanks. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you, Mike.
Great. Thank you so much. Great presentation. You've been doing a lot of work there. It's great to see how much work you guys have been doing. Here, I'm going to put it back to the slide here. Just to remind people, you can enter a question in the Q&A. But I'm going to start off with, we got an email, I don't know why it keeps on doing that to me, from Megan Neal from Multnomah County reached out to us and wanted us to, I'm going to close out of that. I'll stop sharing my screen for a second here. And to talk about the Earthquake Ready Bridge project and what it means. And maybe Mike or Mauricio, you could just give a brief update if you know where that project is, and then also what it means as it relates to the work that you're doing to have that asset. I know that you don't own and manage it, but it's certainly a vital link to the city. And then maybe Kim can talk a little bit about regionally what that might mean.
Well, it's a project that I know fairly well. I was in the earliest work and represented the city in the early stages of the plan. I think the project is it's in good shape. You know, we know what we need to do. It's turned out to be an expensive project, which is an issue that's come up a lot. Resiliency, replacing bridges. You know, it's not an easy thing, and there's not a lot of money to dedicate to that. However, the need stands and the value that in the big idea that the project represents, which is a lifeline between east and west of the Willamette River. In case of a major event, it's still valid, and there's a lot of continued work that the county is doing in that the region needs to do to fund the project. But at this point, we have an alignment that largely, that the city can support, and as we have it defined to date. But there are several challenges ahead. So a lot of it have to do with the financing of it. But it was one of the great examples of how we can take a big project, a mega project, and shape it around resiliency. It's the first one actually I can remember. I worked on the light rail line, so the Telecom crossing is a new crossing, but it wasn't resiliency. Resiliency wasn't the big idea. I've also worked with the county on the Southwood Bridge replacement, which these are two bridges that are more resilient than before. They're not perfectly resilient the way we wanted the Burnside Bridge to be. But I continue to appreciate the county's big idea in how to embrace resiliency at the project level. So that's what I can say at this point.
How about Kim, thinking as it relates to the
And
ETR project?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the ETR work, this was one of the longest routes that really goes from the easternmost of locations in Multnomah County connecting over through the West Hills to Washington County. So that's another piece of it. So it's crossing, not only is it serving as an important connection, as Mauricio said, in downtown Portland and the east and west sides of the river, but it's actually connecting the east and west sides of the region, and just really highlights the importance of that. The regional transportation plan plays a role in it as well, because that in order for that project to be eligible to receive federal transportation dollars and some state transportation dollars, it needs to be in the regional transportation plan in the financially constrained project list. And that, as Mauricio said, the cost of the project has allowed for it to go through the planning phase, but we do not have a construction phase in the regional transportation plan right now, because we don't have the revenues identified in which to pay for it. And so a value of it being in the regional plan is becomes a platform for the region to advocate for those federal and state dollars, in addition to potentially local or regional dollars. That project was one of many that were identified as priorities in the region that were being contemplated as part of the funding measure that the Metro Council put on the ballot 2 years ago now. That did not ultimately pass, but it did provide a way in which to make the case for more investment in our transportation system. And I think doing so in a way that's helping advance the city's goals for a multimodal transportation system while addressing a very important critical need for emergency access and response in the ETR network.
Yeah, thanks. And, one of the things I thought was very effective early on in that project to get support was a video showing that how that bridge would fall down if there was a quake. Recently, there was also, and I know it keeps on coming up, the Columbia River crossing, but it is a vital link as we think about moving people around the region and into the state, both, in recovery, but also in response. And, there was I think an estimate that, TriMet workforce, about 30–40% of the bus drivers live in Washington, the state of Washington, Clark County. Many people in many different employment centers live on the other side of the river. And recently, we're bringing back the CRC again. And Mike, I guess maybe a question for you, thinking statewide, in resiliency, how is the state? I know the CRC is a tricky topic always, but more kind of like as a whole, how is the state looking to the region, but also looking at resiliency of our infrastructure moving forward, particularly with the CRC?
That's a good question, John. I think one of the things I'm looking at between the states, probably for the last 15 years, we've had this ongoing relationship with the state of Washington, and Clark County in particular being part of the metro area. It started with our city readiness initiatives back around public health stuff, 2008, 2009. How to get medical supplies to them if we had a bad day for some sort of biological event. Having said that, our federal partners have identified both the I-5 and the I-205 as critical routes to move federal resources up and down the coastline. So now that both states have completed their transportation assessments, FEMA Region 10 is working to do some, we're not going to do a national level exercises next year, but they are going to work on some workshops and some tabletop exercises. We're hoping that's where we can really kind of stretch out and find out exactly what is the need that, we in the greater Portland metropolitan area need to do to provide to Clark County, when Clark County may be totally cut off from the rest of the state of Washington. So, it's a good question. We've been talking about it for many, many years, but we definitely need some network. We need some bridges across the river in order to provide that services back and forth, whether it's, moving medical supplies or just people. Maybe we need to move them out of harm's way and move them from north to south or vice versa. I can say during the fires in 2020, one of my route, I was under a level 1 the entire time in Clackamas County, and my area I was going to go to was in Clark County with some neighbors and friends, and so never had to pull that off. But I know it would have been a mad rush to get on 205 like we saw with the transportation. So kind of really working on that piece. I'm not the policy advisor for transportation. I'm just working the resiliency piece here. So I would say that, everything should be on the table. And I would hope that we can get the courage to figure out how to fund these big projects, because mitigation in the world of resiliency, it's not, it's an expensive game, but it's paid off by our scientists have told us, the more we can do in pre-mitigation, the more we can save money in the long term in recovery.
Great, thanks, Mike. One of the things that was brought up in the last workshop was the folks from Clackamas were talking about thinking about islanding. When things happen, they have to kind of like, okay, well, our employees are going to be at their home. They're going to be in locations. Think about where they are and how do they connect within these kind of geographic areas. And Mike mentioned this as part of the RRAP, is that, highlighting this islanding effect. And we had two questions here, I think, which are interesting. They are mitigation forward. And I think the city of Portland, it's great that you're linking these two, where we are pushing people to minimize the amount of, carbon, more bike friendly, more car free, movement of people. And then, also moving towards electric vehicles. That's great on a mitigation side, but it also can be a resiliency recovery side of how people move around after a big event, and they still have mobility options, having that redundancy within the system. So what I guess I'll open it up. I think the city wants to talk a little but more about that, why that's important. But I guess one of the questions was, okay, well, if we move to EVs, how are we thinking? How does that help us as we think about recovery? I know Mike hinted at the critical energy hub possibly being highly effective in not having fuel in here, but can a redundancy of fuels also be something we can benefit from?
Question for who? The city or?
For the people, the city, everyone. I guess
Yeah.
The question is, have you thought about electrification in this?
we think about it every day. It's certainly something that we want to, and we are promoting in the city of Portland. Of course, we don't have the capability to make all cars electric like that, but we understand two things, that we need to de-emphasize our dependency on moving people, by vehicles, especially commuting, but also that the burning of gasoline is not only a reason for climate change, but also is not a good long-term strategy. And in that case, I'm enthusiastic that the private sector is moving to electrification quite rapidly, often faster than governments. So we're doing what we can. However, again, I would imagine that we may be in an event without electricity as well. And imagine what would that happen? We were able to communicate now because we have electricity and communication. So I'm not sure how far can an electric vehicle go if we don't have, we're not connected to the grid, if the grid is down. So there's a lot of elements, there's a lot of pieces of infrastructure, the water, the electricity, the sewer, the roads, and all of that needs to be coordinated, again, the word, so that we have as functioning a system as we can following an event, or as quickly a recovery as we can. So.
Great. Anybody else want to chime in? I think it brings up a critical partner, utilities, a new partner,
Yeah.
Not a new partner. So let's, I guess, move to a little bit about collaboration and what are some barriers? What are some opportunities for collaboration that we should be looking at, as we move forward here? We have a lot of partners, how do we all get at the table? Kim, how are you going to bring them into the RTP discussion?
Yeah, that's a good question there. So we are, just as I said, scoping that work, and so we are trying to define what that engagement is going to look like and what are the opportunities to weigh in. We're still, Metro Regional Center is still not open. So I am working from home. Many of us are working remotely. Not everybody has that ability to work from home. There are a lot of people that are having to go to work. But with that said, I think that's a big challenge for the collaboration. Having forums like this, I think, are really effective at sharing information and increasing awareness regionally, to broader audiences, and connecting with people that we might not be able to have the opportunity to come to a meeting in a certain location. Even before COVID, we were working to go to places where people were already meeting. But I think it's a resource staffing challenge. There's also just a tremendous number of planning activities, big planning activities happening in this region. The interstate bridge replacement, you've already referenced we'll be doing the regional transportation plan update. There's other large scale efforts that are happening. And so it's a lot of the same people. And so there's sort of this tapping stakeholders too many times and just their limited capacity to meaningfully participate, I think, is another challenge that we're trying to think through. But I think having the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization as a convener, but then I think finding ways to bridge that cross-discipline perspectives, I think, is really at a crux of what I think regional transportation plan, to have the transportation folks, but the land use folks, the utilities, green infrastructure folks, climate advocates. We need to have all of those voices helping define what that common vision is, and then figuring out what's Metro's role in that, what's the city of Portland's role, what's PSU's role in that too, and creating ownership by creating sort of a shared vision for how to work together. That's not an easy thing. It's easy to say, but it's a difficult thing to actually make happen. And so I think I really appreciated what Mike Saratella was talking about, is just sort of strengthening and broadening the partnerships, because it's really about the partnerships and having multiple diverse voices as part of the conversation and advocating for the kinds of things that are needed to make the region more resilient. And community engagement is a really centered, equity-centered community engagement is a core part of what that is, not just the part.
I think, Kim, your audio went out just at the very end, but why don't we switch over to Mike and Mauricio and talk a little bit about, I like that idea. We think often in transportation that physical infrastructure, we're responsible, we plan for it, but really what we're doing is planning for people and communities and that social infrastructure. If you were going to give some suggestions about how you've been working on rolling out this idea of resiliency and particularly, some of the underserved communities, what would you tell another, entity in the region to how to go about that or think about that?
I'll let Mike speak. I've spoken too much, but I would say that we have an example. Basically, we're learning as like everybody, we're learning a new profession, a new way of thinking, which is resiliency. And just asking their question, problem definition is a lot of the what you need to do. In this case, for us, it was just listening. What is it that needs to happen? So early on, we partnered with students at PSU to do a project in the Park Rose area, and we learned a lot. I think maybe Mike can summarize that quickly.
Yeah, I was going to mention that project and then also some of our COVID work as a good example of that. So we worked with a Portland State Masters in Urban Regional Planning group of grad students a couple years ago to do a sort of test case of what would it look like for a community-driven active transportation project or plan to look like through the lens of islanding, through the lens of resiliency, through the lens of access to essential and important destinations. And so it's a really great report. I'll share the link with this group. But it's a great test case of basically convening and listening to community organizations, having the humility in the space of coming into a space as a government bureaucrat, but having the humility to listen to existing community institutions, churches, civic organizations, schools that really know the challenges and know their neighbors well and know the best places to connect people to. And then thinking about, okay, we have this information. How do we as a city help serve those needs that we've heard through that process? I think this is particularly acute and important in our areas of the city that are at risk of major isolation. So we did that first in Park Rose, which is bounded by a bunch of structurally deficient bridges over the interstates and the area north of Sandy Boulevard, which is in a high liquefaction risk zone. It also is a high equity community with a high share of people living in poverty and high share of BIPOC Portlanders living there as well. And so we learned a lot through that process, and that has informed a lot of the ways that we think and talk about this community level resiliency, the idea of social infrastructure, the idea of focusing on places and connections rather than the physical infrastructure as the be all end all. A second example is some work that we led through our Safe Streets initiative around COVID, working through a partnership with the Seoul District Business Association to identify needs in the MLK corridor in Northeast Portland related to the pandemic, and then adapting our programs and being really pretty creative and really bending stretching the limits of the rules around what we could do to help support people and meet them where they're at. And so that really manifests in a recurring Saturday street closure market that could serve as a space. We heard that people needed space for economic activity and connection. And so we were able to use our permitting team's resources to close streets, open up the street for community to have microenterprise, to open a vaccine clinic and do all of that work. Because we do manage so much of the public space in the city. Turns out if you open it up for people, they will use it for those social and community uses.
Great, great, thanks. We had a question here. Is there any talks about other types of transportation, such as boats, to move from the west to east, vice versa, or aircraft? How, we are very kind of street focused here. How about the port and maritime aircrafts?
Yeah, I don't think we have the port here, but we do have an effort led by a nonprofit called Friends of Frog Ferry. TriMet and the City of Portland, we have been partnering with them to advance their idea that their vision is to have a ferry service from Vancouver, downtown Vancouver, eventually to Milwaukee. So we've, City of Portland, partnered with them to apply to an FTA, that's Federal Transit Administration grant, and we should be hearing pretty soon. It's an opportunity to test a pilot to move folks from St. John's to downtown and test, actually literally test the waters, see if it works and what the demand will be, what the technical challenges are. That Frog Ferry is marketing the branding the program as also as a resiliency move, in the sense that if bridges are down, water-bound transportation could be a critical link, especially in the part of the emergency right after the event. So that it has come up. I think that was part of the grant that was written into the grant as an opportunity for resiliency as when we submitted the application to the federal government. So yeah, that could happen.
Mike, do you want to just add anything about the work and discussions you might have had with the port?
Well, yeah, thanks. So the Port of Portland, we spoke with them not only about the airports, but the seaport and Terminal 6, all their terminals. There's only 4 airports in the state of Oregon. There's 97 public airports, and only 4 airports have had a seismic assessment done on: Newport, Scappoose, Hillsborough, and Portland. So that information then feeds into a lot of other things for the next planning. I think everybody's aware the Port of Portland is looking to do something to strengthen the south runway, much like the Sendai runway in Japan. That would take it offline for a couple of years to make it earthquake resilient for about 6,000 foot. So that would be a way to bring in additional resources and help, move people in and out of the area. Because there's going to be people from Oregon are going to want to leave if they don't have power or water for not days, weeks, or months. And so, the important piece of, I like the question around the, using electricity for vehicles and stuff. This is going to be a tough one because our grid is pretty fragile, just like our road system is. And so, we're very dependent upon our federal partners and also the public private sector to keep doing that. I think Northwest Natural Gas has done an awesome job over the last 20 to 30 years. And PGE and Pacific Corp are feeling a little bit of the pain these days because of what an ice storm can do to us, let alone a natural disaster like an earthquake. So yeah, we're definitely going to be very heavily dependent upon rotary wing helicopters bringing supplies into the valley and from the valley into the coast for a very long period of time. I'm not one to say it's going to be, well, on this day we're going to switch from that to this. It all depends really how bad the community gets shaken, how bad the aftershocks are, and how strong our infrastructure is at the time when the event does happen.
Great. Well, I want to thank all the speakers. We're at time, and I want to make sure that everybody on the call also is, or the webinar can get to their next thing. I do want to mention, well, first of all, thank you for participating. Thank you for being on the webinar and listening to this. This is, again, one conversation. We're hoping that this continues to go. Our next one will be hopefully in early February to talk about recovery planning best practices. And we will get that out to everybody that participated on this call, that that you can maybe sign up and participate in this workshop and discussion. So I just want to thank everybody for participating, and I know I could have gone on for another half hour at least for questions, but I know it's only the one of many conversations we will continue to have. So thanks, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, John.